Okay, so ready to really shake things up today.
Always up for a challenge.
Good, because we're tackling Nietzsche.
Ah, Nietzsche. Bold choice.
Yeah, no, no kidding. Genealogy of Morals, to be exact. We're going deep on this one. This book, well, it's not exactly, beach reading,
Definitely requires some mental heavy lifting.
but it's powerful stuff. Like, seriously, it makes you question, like, everything you thought you knew about good and evil, right and wrong, all that.
He really digs deep, doesn't he? Challenges those fundamental assumptions we often take for granted.
Exactly. He's like, forget what you think you know. Let's, like, really unpack this whole idea of morality. Where does it come from? Who benefits from these so-called universal truths? And, he doesn't hold back. Right from the start, Nietzsche's like, good and evil. Not some eternal truth, folks.
More like products of history, of power struggles playing out over centuries.
Exactly. Mind-blowing.
Yeah, it is. He's really turning morality on its head, forcing us to see it from a whole new perspective.
And this is where his whole master and slave morality thing comes in. Which, can sound a little,
Provocative?
yeah, a bit. But it's important to remember he's not talking about literal masters and slaves, right?
Right.
It's more about understanding these different value systems that have clashed throughout history.
Right. He's saying, look, early societies, they were often dominated by what he calls this master perspective. Strength, nobility, even a certain ruthlessness were valued.
So like survival of the fittest kind of thing.
In a way, yes. Think of it as the values of a warrior class. But it's not just about brute force. Nietzsche also saw a certain creativity, a life-affirming energy in this master morality.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this. So if that's the master perspective, then what about the slaves? How did their values differ?
Well, as you can imagine, this master morality, it often came at the expense of those who were weaker or less powerful. And that's where the slave morality emerges as a kind of reaction, a way of challenging the dominance of the masters.
So the slave morality was about turning the tables, at least on a moral level.
Exactly. They emphasize compassion, humility, self-sacrifice qualities that directly challenged that whole might makes right ethos of the masters.
It's fascinating how these power dynamics play out, even in something as fundamental as morality.
And Nietzsche, he was a master at tracing these power dynamics, even down to the evolution of language itself.
Language. You mean how words can change their meaning over time?
Precisely. He uses the example of the German word schlecht, which means bad. He traces it back to this word schlicht, which originally meant simple or common.
So something associated with, like, the lower classes, the everyday folks, gradually became synonymous with bad. That's kind of chilling when you think about it.
It is, and it shows how these power dynamics can become embedded in our language, our very way of thinking.
It makes you wonder what other hidden histories, what other power struggles are buried in the words we use every day, right?
Right. And this slave morality, with its emphasis on compassion and selflessness, Nietzsche argues that it eventually became the dominant mode of thinking in the West, at least for a while.
Okay, so we've got these two clashing moral systems, but Nietzsche doesn't stop there. He then dives into this whole concept of guilt, and that's where things get really interesting, I think.
Because he argues that guilt, it's not some inherent human instinct. It's not something we're born with.
So it's learned.
In a way, yes. He says it's cultivated over centuries, intimately tied to this whole idea of debt and punishment.
Debt and punishment. What you're saying, like, my student loans are making me feel guilty? Because I can relate to that.
Well, let's just say there's a connection there. But think back to early societies. Back then, punishment, it wasn't necessarily about some abstract sense of right and wrong. It was much more about settling debts, about the injured party getting revenge.
So it was more like a transaction, though. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Exactly. And Nietzsche argues that this primal urge for retribution, for balancing the scales, it laid the groundwork for our modern ideas of guilt, even our sense of duty towards others.
Wow. So, like, our whole concept of justice, it's all rooted in this ancient desire for revenge.
Yeah.
Makes you think, huh?
Right. It's like, are we really as impartial as we like to believe? Or are we still, on some level, driven by those primal urges?
Deep stuff. And this kind of leads us to another big Nietzsche idea, the will to power. Though I got to say, that term always makes me think of, like, supervillains trying to take over the world.
Yeah, it's a bit loaded, isn't it? But Nietzsche's view of power was much more nuanced than just, raw domination.
So not just about being, like, The strongest or richest or whatever.
Exactly. For Nietzsche, the will to power was more of this fundamental life force, this drive to grow, to overcome, to create. It's happening on both a personal level and a societal level.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So it's less about ruling over others and more about, like, mastering yourself, mastering your own life.
You could put it that way. It's about expressing yourself fully, realizing your potential, leaving your mark on the world.
So everything we do, from, like, writing a poem to starting a business, it can all be seen as an expression of this will to power.
Precisely. It's all about striving, creating, expanding your horizons. And here's when it gets really interesting. Nietzsche argues that even actions that seem on the surface to be about self-denial, things like embracing chastity or poverty, even those can be expressions of the will to power.
Wait, hold on. How can denying yourself be a form of power? That doesn't make sense.
Well, think about it this way. Sometimes denying a desire, conquering an impulse, can be its own form of mastery, right? Nietzsche believed that these seemingly ascetic ideals, they often served a deeper purpose.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me an example.
He talks about Richard Wagner, the composer. Wagner, famous for these incredibly passionate, dramatic operas. But later in life, Wagner starts praising chastity.
Interesting. So a guy known for his, like, larger-than-life emotions is suddenly all about self-restraint. What's Nietzsche's take on that?
Well, Nietzsche saw it as kind of a turning away from the world, a rejection of those very impulses that fueled Wagner's art. And it wasn't just Wagner. Nietzsche saw this tendency in other artists and thinkers too.
So for Nietzsche, this inward focus, this emphasis on self-denial, it was almost like a weakening of the will to power.
In a way, yes. He saw it as a less potent expression of that life force than, say, the creation of art or the pursuit of knowledge.
That's a fascinating perspective. But if even our seemingly selfless acts can be traced back to this will to power, does that mean true altruism is impossible? Like, we're always doing things for ourselves on some level.
That's a tough question. Nietzsche didn't really offer easy answers. He acknowledged the complexity of human motivation. He believed that even our most selfless acts, they're often driven by a mix of conscious and unconscious desires.
So it's not as simple as saying, oh, people are just selfish or people are inherently good.
Yeah.
We're more complicated than that.
Exactly. We're a mix of contradictions. And for Nietzsche, understanding the will to power, in all its messy complexity, was key to understanding what it means to be human.
I mean, this whole will to power thing, it's like everywhere once you start looking for it, right? It's like Nietzsche gives you these new eyes to see the world.
He really does, and he's not afraid to challenge our assumptions, to make us uncomfortable, which, let's face it, is kind of refreshing sometimes, isn't it?
For sure. Speaking of uncomfortable, we got to talk about, the elephant in the room, Nietzsche's big bombshell.
God is dead.
That's the one. Still freaks people out even today. What did he actually mean by that, do you think? And why does it still matter?
Well, it's one of those things that's often misinterpreted. People hear God is dead, and they assume, like, Nietzsche's this raving atheist running around with a sledgehammer.
Yeah, not exactly as subtle, dude.
Right, but it's more nuanced than that. When Nietzsche said God is dead, he wasn't just making some grand philosophical statement. He was diagnosing something he saw happening in society, this, like, crisis of faith.
He was saying that people were losing their belief in God.
Not just losing their belief, but that the whole idea of God, this God of absolute truth, absolute authority, it was losing its power.
So it was more like the death of an idea, a way of seeing the world, than the death of God, like literally.
Exactly. Nietzsche recognized that with science, with secularism, with all the changes happening in the world, those old certainties were crumbling. People were starting to question everything.
And this death of God, it wasn't something Nietzsche mourned. It was almost like he saw it as an opportunity. Why is that?
Because he saw it as a chance for humanity to break free from these, like, imposed values. If there's no God dictating right and wrong, then who gets to decide? We do, each of us.
But that's a lot of responsibility, right? I mean, it's kind of freeing, but it's also terrifying.
Absolutely, and Nietzsche knew that. He understood the dangers of this death of God, the potential for nihilism, for people to say, well, if nothing matters, then why not just do whatever I want?
Which is kind of a recipe for chaos, to say the least.
For sure. But Nietzsche believed we were capable of more than that. He believed that this death of God, as frightening as it was, also presented an incredible opportunity for humanity to grow up, to create our own values, our own meaning.
So it's like this double-edged sword. We're liberated from all the old rules,
Right.
but then we have to figure out, Like, what do we replace them with? What do we really believe in?
Exactly. It's on us to figure it out. There's no instruction manual, no divine blueprint. We have to create our own meaning. And that can be daunting, but it can also be exhilarating.
No kidding. That's quite a legacy Nietzsche left us with. I don't even know if I'd call it comforting, but it's definitely thought-provoking.
It is challenging, but also strangely empowering. He reminds us that we have this incredible capacity for both good and evil, for creativity and destruction. It's up to us to choose what we'll do with that power.
Well, I think that's about as clear a picture of Nietzsche's worldview as we're going to get. He certainly gave us a lot to think about.
He did. And maybe that's the point. To keep asking these questions, to keep pushing ourselves, to understand ourselves and the world around us a little bit better.
I like that. Always keep questioning. So next time you find yourself wrestling with those big questions about good and evil, about power, about the meaning of life, the whole shebang, remember Nietzsche's challenge.
Well,
Don't just accept the easy answers. Think for yourself, question everything, and maybe, just maybe, dare to create your own values in a world that's still figuring things out.